Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for our webinar, Maples Are People, an Indigenous Critique of Ecocide, Genocide, and Human Nature Dualism with Professor Zoryan Eichler of the Old Dominion University. My name is Megan Reed, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director for the Zoryan Institute, and I will be today's moderator. Today's session is the second webinar of Zoryan Institute's fourth installment of the Genocide and Human Rights webinar series, which is centered around the subject of climate change and its relationship to human rights. You can access the recordings of past sessions on our website, and my colleague Allison will be sharing the link for this in the chat box for you. So in addition to today's highly anticipated session, we have a very exciting lineup of webinars in the coming weeks. We have one on Indigenous peoples, colonialism, and climate justice, another on the role of human rights, citizen suits, and domestic courts in limiting dangerous climate change, and our final session on changing geopolitical borders and the future in the face of climate change. So we look forward to seeing you at those upcoming sessions as well. And a few housekeeping items before I give our host a proper introduction. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A box. We would also like to encourage you to use the raise your hand function to ask your question out loud. There will be a 20 to 30 minute Q&A session at the end of today's presentation to address some of these questions. And if you have any specific questions for the Institute, you're welcome to ask them in the chat box, or you can send us an email to admin@genocidestudies.org. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Professor Zoryan Eichler. Professor Eichler is a lecturer in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Old Dominion University. In addition to genocide studies, her areas of specialization include Native American philosophies, environmental ethics, feminist philosophies, and philosophy of race. Her research has been published in Environment and Society, Environmental Ethics, Genocide Studies and Prevention, an international journal, and Ethics, Policy, and Environment. Professor Eichler, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. And I just want to thank Allison Rodriguez and Megan Reed and the other members of the Zoryan Institute for inviting me to present today and for planning this series of webinars. I think it's really important to be talking about ecocide in relation to genocide. And so I'm very privileged to be here, and I look forward to our discussion at the end of the session. So before I get started, I just want to make a few introductions, and then I will bring up some slides. I cover a lot in this presentation, so I will try and do my best to stay on track with time. But I may move pretty quickly through some of the concepts, and I encourage you to ask questions going into more detail in the discussion section. So I want to start first by acknowledging the land that I'm speaking from. And today I'm speaking to you from the traditional lands of the people of the Powhatan Confederacy, a group of Algonquin-speaking peoples indigenous to North America. For thousands of years, they and the other indigenous inhabitants of this place, now known as Virginia, maintained these lands. And that all changed in 1607, when 104 Englishmen landed on the shores of what we now call Virginia Beach. I'm presenting this talk to you just 20 miles from there. In the intervening time between then and now, colonization, genocide, and ecocide reshaped the land, water, cultures, and peoples who inhabited and inhabit this place. The land has been transformed from forests, swamps, marshes, and wetlands to housing developments and farms. Today, there are only 11 federally recognized Native tribes in Virginia. Of those 11 tribes, only 2, the Pamunkey and the Mattaponi, have state recognized reservations, which total an area of less than 3 square miles. Though this presentation isn't going to focus on the tribes of Virginia, I'm hoping that this brief history helps to set the stage for this presentation, which explores how colonization, ecocide, and genocide coincide for Indigenous peoples to uproot and destroy Indigenous knowledge, culture, and bodies. So in today's presentation, I'm going to examine what ecocide is, how ecocide has affected Indigenous peoples, assess the value of international ecocide law for Indigenous peoples, and make the case that Indigenous sovereignty is an important element of ecocide prevention and mitigation. As a philosopher, my approach will be largely philosophical, So I'll be analyzing these issues through the lens of metaphysical, epistemological, and ethical inquiry. As such, the focus of this presentation is primarily on the metaphysical harms of ecocide for Indigenous peoples and how Western colonial conceptions of humans, nature, and race have contributed to the conditions that have led to the forms that ecocide takes today, its impact on Indigenous peoples, and the limitations of global legal frameworks for preventing ecocide and the genocide of Indigenous peoples. Lastly, as a settler of Jewish European descent, my aim here is to amplify the experiences and voices of Indigenous scholars on the topics of ecocide, genocide, and environmental ethics. By calling attention to both the ways that Indigenous peoples have been uniquely harmed by ecocide, as well as to make the case that Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous-led environmental activism and politics is necessary to prevent and mitigate the effects of ecocide. So though this talk will also largely focus on the effects that Indigenous peoples have suffered, it's not the case that Indigenous people are passive victims, accepting their fate. Indigenous communities have led and continue to lead efforts to combat climate change, to support conservation and sustainable environmental practice and policy, and to produce knowledge that will help preserve their communities despite the harms that they've experienced. So at this point, I'm going to bring up some slides so that you can follow along with me. Give me one moment while I share my screen. So my talk today is entitled Maples Are People, an Indigenous Analysis of Ecocide, Genocide, and the Human Nature Dualism. And I want to start by raising some questions for consideration. Since this is an ongoing topic of research for myself, these are the questions that have kind of led me to explore and do the research that I'm doing. And I also want these questions to perhaps be points to launch discussion later on in the presentation. So first, why is it important to recognize that Indigenous communities experience different harms from ecocide than other groups? What is the link between ecocide, racism, and the devaluation of nature? How does this relationship clarify the harms ecocide causes Indigenous people? How do Indigenous philosophies contest the human nature dualism that characterizes Western thought? And how can they offer insights for ecocide prevention? What are the benefits and limitations of international ecocide law for Indigenous peoples? Should ecocide be considered a separate crime from genocide? And finally, why does Indigenous sovereignty matter for preventing or mitigating ecocide? So these are the questions, like I said, that have sort of prompted me to do the kind of research that I'm doing, but also are the questions that I would like you to think about as we get into this presentation. So first, I want to give a brief overview of the place of ecocide in international law today. And I want to start by defining ecocide. So the term ecocide was coined in 1970 by a group of scientists in order to describe the environmental devastation that was wrought to the land in Vietnam as a result of chemical weapons like Agent Orange. Later, it was defined by lawyer, activist, and co-founder of the nonprofit Stop Ecocide International, Polly Higgins, as the definition that we see here: the extensive destruction, damage to, or loss of ecosystems of a given territory to such an extent that peaceful enjoyment by the inhabitants of that territory has been severely diminished. As you can see from this definition, ecocide extends not just to the consequences of human agency, but also to non-human forces such as tsunamis, hurricanes, or earthquakes. For the purpose of understanding the role of ecocide in international law, however, we'll be focusing on the human-caused or ascertainable forms of ecocide, since those are the things that could be considered criminal acts. Another thing to notice about this definition is that there's no mention of intent. By contrast, the definition of genocide stipulates that the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part is what is a necessary component of making genocide a crime. Here, ecocide does not have that intent component. So if we're trying to understand ecocide, I think one of the main themes of this webinar series is climate change. Though climate change is one form that ecocide takes, there are lots of other ways that ecocide is practiced or manifests. These include things like the overuse of pesticides, fracking, drilling, or mining for natural resources, the destruction or extinction of species and ecosystems, pollution, deforestation, the damming of rivers, and of course, climate change. So, though the concept of ecocide has gained traction among environmentalists, advocates for Indigenous rights, and now genocide scholars, ecocide is still not considered an international crime, except in a very limited sense. In Article 8.2b.4 of the Rome Statute, which is the statute regarding war crimes, this states that in the case of international conflict, environmental destruction may be considered a war crime if the accused party intentionally launches an attack in the knowledge that such attack will cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment, which would be clearly excessive in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage anticipated. And a couple of things, of course, to notice here is that this is limited to cases of international conflict, not even like national civil war. And it has to be intentional. So there is an element of intent involved. However, some countries have begun to incorporate laws or provisions against ecocide into their constitutions, or to just have general laws preventing ecocide. So as of 2019, only 10 countries had adopted laws criminalizing ecocide, including Belarus, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, the Republic of Armenia, the Republic of Moldova, the Russian Federation, Tajikistan, Ukraine, and Vietnam. Other countries like Ecuador and Colombia have sections devoted to environmental rights in their national constitutions, while other countries like New Zealand and India have begun granting legal rights to environmental entities, including rivers, mountains, and land within national parks. And I'll go back to that a little bit later as well. However, this patchwork of laws and policies can't protect against the most threatening form of ecocide, which is climate change, the causes of which are often rooted in other locales around the globe and are tied to the functioning of the global capitalist economy, which is why, in some regards, we need an international approach to ecocide law. So the inclusion of ecocide as an international crime has been debated at the United Nations numerous times between 1973 and now. One of the most promising efforts that was made was in 2010, when Polly Higgins helped to lead a proposal to amend the Rome Statute to include ecocide as a fifth crime against peace, alongside crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. However, the effort to amend the Rome Statute failed. Though that was a setback, activists have remained undeterred, and following in her footsteps, the Stop Ecocide Foundation gathered a panel of experts led by lawyers Philippa Sands and Dior Falso to devise a new legal definition of ecocide to present before the United Nations to amend the Rome Statute. This new definition, which was written in 2021, states, for the purpose of this statute, ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment caused by those acts. Again, this definition does not mention an explicit intent to destroy the environment. Rather, the activity must be committed with the knowledge that the action will have likely harmful effects. In an interview, Sands explained that they deliberately chose not to tie ecocide to the crime of genocide, primarily because ecocide doesn't always involve intent. This means that ecocide is closer to the statute's definition of crimes against humanity, which may include harms caused by reckless or negligent actions. Furthermore, Sands takes a pragmatic approach to the proposal to make ecocide the fifth crime against peace, stating, and these are in his words, My target is not that it be the statute, but that there be a serious debate about the idea. So what this means for making ecocide an international crime is somewhat unclear, because on the one hand, it wants to foster debate. On the other, it's acknowledging that there is a real possibility that it won't become an international crime. So now that I've given us a brief overview of where ecocide stands in international law at the moment, I want to turn our attention to the impacts of ecocide on Indigenous people. And I'm going to come back to the role and place of ecocide in international law towards the end of the presentation. So before I get into the impacts of ecocide on Indigenous peoples, I want to very briefly define what I mean by Indigenous. So usually, or when I'm talking about Indigenous here, I'm referring to people who are either the earliest known inhabitants to a place or people who are living in a place prior to European colonization. The Indigenous philosophies that I refer to in this presentation will be primarily from Native American and First Nations peoples, and to a lesser extent from Australian Aboriginal and Maori communities. Though I will at times be speaking about an Indigenous worldview or a Native American worldview, I'll use this general way of speaking only as a means of contrasting it with the dominant Western-colonial worldview, which also is a generalization. Indigenous peoples don't have a homogeneous view of the world, and even within a single continent like North America, notions of identity, origin, ethics, epistemology, and ontology can differ in really significant ways. So whenever possible, I'll identify which communities are associated with particular philosophies. And I'd also like to state that simply because Indigenous groups have worldviews, ethical frameworks, and metaphysical beliefs that present a view of human-nature relations that doesn't entail human domination over nature, it does not mean that Indigenous people have some special or mystical connection to nature. The purpose here isn't to romanticize Indigenous peoples, but to consider how particular worldviews and philosophies regarding nature can give us insight into the harms of ecocide and lead to more ethical relations between humans and the rest of the natural world. So in what follows, I'm going to argue that ecocide harms Indigenous peoples at two different registers. At the material and physical level by harming Indigenous bodies and resources, and at the metaphysical level by harming Indigenous group identity, worldviews, epistemologies, and moral norms. And the factors that are contributing to these harms that I'll focus on are environmental racism, essentialism, and the human nature dualism. So first, I'm going to briefly define what I mean by physical and material harm. By physical harm, I mean harms inflicted on the bodies and health and the lifespans of Indigenous people. So these harms include exposing Indigenous people to toxins, pollutants, and radioactive materials. The effects of these harms may increase cancer rates, increase in birth defects and stillbirths, as well as other diseases. It might also involve lack of medical support or monetary support or compensation from local and federal governments or polluting industries. Material harm also refers to material resources and wealth, harms done to material resources and wealth of Indigenous communities, such as the destruction of food sources and sources of traditional medicine, pollution or destruction of land and water needed for sustenance, or the destruction of sacred sites and burial grounds, and the destruction of traditional plant sources. So oftentimes these two forms of harm are interlinked in explicit ways. And so I'll kind of go through a few different examples to show how ecocide has affected the material and physical well-being of Indigenous peoples. So my first example is referring to the oil spills in the Niger Delta. So since the 1990s, there has been ongoing conflict in the Niger Delta between large oil corporations like Shell and Eni, and Indigenous communities like the Ogoni and Ijaw peoples, over the exploitation of land, labor, and resources, and the accompanying destruction of local ecosystems. While the oil industry has brought benefits to the country of Nigeria in the terms mostly of economic growth, oil spills and pollution in the region, not to mention the greenhouse gases emitted by the oil upon use, have been especially harmful to Indigenous groups who want to continue traditional modes of living, and who rely on healthy ecosystems, water, and land to do so. Oil pollution and spills in the region have caused massive destruction to farmlands, sources of drinking water, mangrove forests, and fishing grounds. In addition to this, some oil spills have been so devastating that they've required some communities to relocate entirely, leaving behind their ancestral homes. So in this example, we have both physical harms being done to the bodies of Indigenous people, the destruction of their lands and their traditional ways of life, providing material harms. And these material harms also affect their lives and their ability to live well. Another example involves the uranium mining in Navajo country. Uranium ore was mined from 1942 to the mid-1980s on traditional Dene land, involving over 2,500 mines and employing over 3,000 Dene people, most of whom were at the time that they were hired unaware of the health risks. And even though during this early phase of uranium mining, before uranium was entirely understood to have the nuclear capacities that it does, there were suspicions about the potential health risks, and these weren't communicated properly to the people. And at the time, the Navajo had already been forced to cede quite a bit of their land and were facing levels of poverty that made it really appealing to allow mining companies to come onto their land and provide people with jobs. However, mining involved the destruction of many sacred lands, especially 4 key mountains that are part of the origin story of the Navajo people. So according to Navajo origin stories, the people came from under the earth and emerged onto the land with the soil and the necessary tools to help them survive in this world. And so this land itself is the site where this mining was occurring. In addition to this, there was contamination of important waterways. So on July 16th, 1979, for example, 93 million gallons of radioactive waste was released into the Rio Puerco, marking the largest radioactive waste spill in US history. Cleanup did occur, but it was slow and somewhat patchy. And for years, Indigenous people had to fight to have some kind of compensation. So it wasn't until the 1990s that the United States Congress finally passed a bill that would allow miners who were affected to receive some compensation. And even then, the efforts to get that compensation were often convoluted and difficult and weren't universally offered. The material and physical effects of this involved, in part, the destruction of their lands, their waterways, and their ability to survive on their lands, but also included health effects like radiation poisoning, increased rates of lung cancer, scoliosis, and birth defects. And after all of this, the profits from the uranium mining largely went to the companies and to the US government and did not really trickle down significantly to the Dene people. The third example involves the decimation of the North American buffalo. So before 1800, 30 million to 60 million buffalo lived on the plains from northern Saskatchewan to New Mexico, as far east as the Appalachian Mountains. Their presence shaped the environment, making them a keystone species. For the Plains tribes, the buffalo were a crucial component of their cultures and social fabric. Not only did the buffalo create a particular habitat suited to diverse ecosystems in which Indigenous peoples could survive, their bodies provided a source of food, clothing, shelter, and other tools. In addition to this, the buffalo were also central to the spiritual identity of many of the communities. According to Black Elk of the Lakota Sioux, it was white buffalo cow woman who, in the beginning, brought to us our most sacred pipe. And from that time, we have been related to the four-leggeds and all that moves. Tatanka, the buffalo, is the closest four-legged relative that we have, and they live as a people as we do. By the mid-1800s, the buffalo populations were starting to decline. White settlers who were bringing their cattle onto the land displaced the buffalo, leading to greater demand for buffalo, which was forcing tribes to vacate their traditional homelands which is also causing greater demand for land in buffalo further west. This was also accompanied by a sudden growth in the buffalo hide robe market. In 1835, the American Fur Company alone had an order for 36,000 buffalo robes. By 1857, the number of hides delivered to retailers was up to 70,400 hides a year. And between 1872 and 1873, over 825,000 hides were transported by rail from the plains to the east. In addition to this devastation, there were hunters, tourists who would come out onto the plains on trains and shoot buffalo from the windows. And furthermore, there was also the military. The military were part of the extermination of buffalo with the explicit purpose of, one of the explicit purposes they had in killing the buffalo was to starve indigenous communities. So indigenous communities, such as the Lakota, Osage, Comanche, and Wichita, who relied on buffalo for clothing, food, shelter, and tools, faced starvation, displacement, and the collapse of their traditional means of subsistence and culture. It also forced them in many ways to begin relying on the economic systems and food systems of the settlers, particularly in the case of removing buffalo as a food source and replacing it with beef that was raised by cattle ranchers, settler cattle ranchers. My final example of ecocide and how it affects indigenous peoples is climate change. Rising global temperatures are threatening the integrity of land, ecosystems, and human and non-human flourishing worldwide. Despite the abundance of evidence and scientific reports that have been released since the 1950s, nations and corporations haven't done nearly enough to prevent catastrophic changes from occurring. And in fact, there was just a report released a few days ago from the UN detailing just how significantly countries have failed to address the causes of climate change and how this is going to lead to some really serious consequences. One of the reasons that these changes haven't been addressed is that wealthy nations and corporations have little incentive to change their behavior because they're motivated by short-term gains and profit. Pleasing constituents, pleasing shareholders is necessary in order for those in power to stay in power and for companies to continue to make money and receive investors. Though indigenous peoples as a whole are some of the least likely to contribute to climate change, their life on the margins of Western society makes them more vulnerable to food and water security, economic insecurity, and to the negative health effects of climate change. And of course, this isn't just indigenous people who experience this, but people of all sorts of underclass or oppressed groups as well. But for indigenous people, many indigenous communities exist within colonial nation states or are still grappling with the legacies of the colonial imposition that disrupted the material, cultural, political, and spiritual aspects of their communities, which makes it even more difficult for them to respond to the crisis of climate change. And part of the challenges that indigenous communities face, particularly the ones that are located within colonial nation states, is that they lack the political and economic power to demand change or to implement their own methods of change. So even if they would like to adopt policies or to institute institutions or methods of behavior that would limit climate change, they have a very limited reach in doing so, and often have to bend to the whims and the goals and policies of the colonial nation state. So these four examples give us some kind of context or some ways of thinking about how ecocide, these different forms of ecocide, right? The extractive resources, the destruction of species, climate change, how each of these impacts indigenous people, causing them material and physical harm. But I also want to make the case that one of the things that links these is a particular attitude towards indigenous people. So it's not a coincidence then Indigenous people have been victims of these various forms of ecocide. Ecocide has become another method for colonial powers and industries to eliminate Indigenous people in order to acquire their territory in a world in which colonial expansion via war is largely seen as unacceptable. Though, as I say this, to acknowledge what's happening in Ukraine right now. However, if colonial invasion is a structure, not an event, as Patrick Wolf claims, then we can interpret ecocide as another means for colonial powers, their sympathizers, and predatory industries to accumulate resources, power, and wealth by finding alternate ways to exploit the land that remains in Indigenous care, often in the name of economic growth, energy security, conservation, or some other platitude about the greater good. In this respect, to borrow a notion from Michel Foucault, ecocide is a technology of power that allows the dominant colonial states and corporations to continue to exploit Indigenous peoples and other largely non-white populations by targeting their lands for industrial development, for waste, or for resource extraction. As Deborah Bird Rose has pointed out, in order to get in the way of the colonial project, the only thing Indigenous people need to do is stay home. However, according to the logic of the colonial state, if their homes are destroyed, then Indigenous people will either die or be forced to leave. Given this, I propose that ecocide in the context described above is a form of environmental racism directed at Indigenous peoples and other non-white races. According to Foucault, in many modern democratic nations, the public largely perceives the function of government to be the preservation of the life of the nation's citizens and the protection of their property. However, within this biopolitical state that is geared towards making people live by removing risk to life, there needs to be a way to eliminate the unwanted or the impure element of society. This, for Foucault, is a function of racism. Racism, he says, is primarily a way of introducing a break into the domain of life that is under power's control, the break between what must live and what must die. In other words, racism is the biopolitical justification for allowing some people to die to cut out a perceived internal threat to the health and purity of the population, often seen as white, as a whole. According to Tracy Bryn Royals, environmental racism occurs when communities of color are disproportionately exposed to or deliberately targeted for environmental harm. Ecocide intersects with racism when communities of color and Indigenous communities experience disproportionate harms, or when their lands and resources are deliberately chosen for exploitation or destruction. For example, in the film This Changes Everything, journalist and activist Naomi Klein travels to the site of the Athabasca tar sands in Alberta, Canada. The tar sands, which are nearly equivalent in square mileage to the state of Florida, are located on the traditional land of the Cree peoples. In an interview at Fort McMurray with Rod McKinney, a white mechanic at the tar sands, he states, and this is his quote, "I won't say it's a wasteland, but certainly if the oil sands wasn't here, nobody would even know where this land was." In contrast, Crystal Lameman of the Beaver Lake Cree Nation sees the land as more than just a resource to be exploited. She says, "When these people came over, they wanted to own the land. We don't believe that. We believe the land owns us. We're just here as visitors on this land." She also notes the destruction of forest, the decline in caribou populations, the prevalence of oil spills and leaks that contaminate land and water, all of which are in fact affecting the Indigenous people who still live in the area. As this section of the film shows, the Indigenous people suffer while white settlers come to the area for just a few years to get rich working at the tar sands and the tar fields before leaving again. This puts Indigenous people in an existential bind. As Max Liboiron of the Métis notes, polluted lands cannot simply be abandoned. Indigenous peoples often have complex cultural ties to lands, waters, plants, and animals that they live with, and to abandon the place would be to kill off part of their culture and identity. Even knowing how pollution is affecting their land, water, and food, some people continue to eat food that's been contaminated by PVCs from plastics, for example, because, and to quote Liboiron, "The stakes of not eating the food are cultural genocide, where the languages, practices, knowledge, and thus relations with land are killed. Ecocide thus forces Indigenous people into a situation of either putting their bodies and health at risk or of losing important aspects of their identity as Indigenous people. In this sense, ecocide as environmental racism is quite literally a way in which states allow Indigenous people to die. So I want to explore a little bit more of the thought process behind environmental racism, and in particular, the logic and the metaphysical assumptions that make it possible. In addition, I want to set this up in contrast to Indigenous metaphysical beliefs, Indigenous worldviews, and ways of understanding the world. So I'll start with the metaphysical assumptions of the West, and then I will turn to Indigenous metaphysical beliefs. So if we accept that ecocide has been used as a tool of environmental racism and colonial subjugation of Indigenous peoples, then we're already on our way to understanding some of the metaphysical harms of ecocide. By metaphysical harms, I mean harms to a community's sense of identity as a group, to their worldview or their understanding of reality, and to their relationality, that is, to the way they relate and connect to and see connections between themselves and between themselves and nature. There are two metaphysical harms I'd like to consider in what follows: essentialism and the human nature dualism. Essentialism is a commitment to a rendering of reality and the beings and states that constitute it, such that beings can be separated into natural kinds according to fixed or unchanging essences. Essentialist thinking entails believing that the nature of a thing is determined by a fixed, unalterable core property that it shares only with others of its own kind. An essence, according to Aristotle, is what something is. In other words, an essence defines one type of being from another. It is a being's primary substance. Members of the same kind are perceived as having the same essence. Essences are considered to be simple and unchanging. They adhere to the principle of identity, which states that each thing is identical with itself. In other words, essences are what they are. As simple, unchanging, and defining characteristics, essences delineate sharp boundaries between natural kinds, which means that beings that possess different essences are fundamentally different. Beings also cannot have more than one essence. All characteristics attributed to a being are considered accidental. Essences also provide grounds for making inductive inferences about members of natural kinds. Essences are presumed to cause the attribute typically displayed by individual members of a given natural kind. So if essences cause attributes, then it's possible to infer certain behaviors or characteristics based on what type of essence a being has. And this becomes something like stereotyping. This means that members of natural kinds are inherently predictable insofar as they share an essence with other members of the same kind. When essences are attributed to racial categories, this leads to racialist thinking, the belief that races are fundamentally different groups of human beings that can be sorted using phenotypical, geographical, and heritable characteristics. And each of these groups possesses a different defining essence that is expressed through non-physical traits like culture, moral character, and emotional capacity. So in other words, if a race has a particular essence, that essence will not only manifest in physical characteristics, but will also manifest in cultural, mental, moral characteristics as well. So things that have nothing to do with the ocular perception of race. Racialist thinking becomes racist when these essences are also taken to denote a natural and moral hierarchy between groups. And this concept of hierarchy is also linked to another aspect of Western metaphysical thought or Western logical thought, and that has to do with dualism. According to ecofeminist philosopher Val Plumwood, dualism is a relation of separation and domination inscribed and naturalized in culture and characterized by radical exclusion, distancing, and opposition between orders, construed as systematically higher and lower, as inferior and superior, ruler and ruled, center, and periphery. It treats the division as part of the natures of beings, construed as not merely different, but as belonging to radically different orders or kinds, and hence not open to change. So as we can see in this definition, there's in dualistic thinking, there's already an assumption of the existence of essences, and these essences map onto the ways in which there are different orders of kinds, and that these different kinds can't change. And furthermore, that these kinds belong in a kind of hierarchical relationship. Some examples of dualisms in Western thought, and these are common dualisms within the history of Western philosophy in particular, are things like human nature dualisms, the human animal, culture and nature, civilized primitive, male female, reason instinct, mind body, subject object, white non-white. Everything left of the slash is regarded as superior to everything to the right of it. And you'll notice that I put here that human and nature is a kind of master category, because in a lot of respects, the human is always affiliated with the things on the left, whereas nature is affiliated with things on the right. And this involves a kind of devaluation of nature and everything that's associated with nature. As Plumwood says, to be defined as nature is to be defined as passive, as non-agent, as non-subject, as the environment or invisible background conditions against which the foreground achievements of reason or culture take place. It is to be defined as terra nullius, a resource empty of its own purposes or meanings, and hence available to be annexed for the purposes of those supposedly identified with reason or intellect. It needs to be seen as part of a sharply separate, even alien lower realm, whose domination is simply natural. So another way of kind of making this clear is to think about some of the ways in which Indigenous people have been dehumanized. So there are various examples within the United States of colonists making this comparison between humans and Indigenous people and nature. So for instance, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but there was one settler who, and I can leave a note for this later, but there's one settler who made a comparison between Native Americans and foxes, saying that they do but run over the ground like foxes and deer, as if there's no purpose. They're just going about following their instincts. Likewise, there was this assumption that because Indigenous people didn't own property or held property in common, that they weren't properly using the land, that they weren't using the land in a rational way, but just living on it the way that other animals did. And since there was already an assumption that animals were inferior, both rationally, intellectually, emotionally, compared to humans in the history of European Western thought, it was really, it was a simple leap for settlers to make this connection between Native people and animals. Especially things were not helped, that languages weren't shared and communication was incredibly difficult in those early days of contact. So the devaluation of nature and specifically non-human animals is a central concern in the work of Sisters Ath and Silko, who argue that this devaluation provides an ontological foundation for justifying various forms of oppression, including racism, sexism, speciesism, and genocide. As they note in their book, Afroism, factual differences between beings, such as having fur, wings, tentacles, and so on, are loaded with cultural meaning, which transform those factual differences into cultural signifiers that relay an ontological and moral conception of difference. Oppressed human groups are frequently dehumanized in comparison by comparing them to other animals or nature, a common theme of settler regard for natives. As such, for the co-sisters, combating the isms of oppression also means calling into question the very notions of animal and nature that are so frequently used to define humanity. As they state, there, the Western white men notion of the animal, construed under their white supremacist framework, is as subhuman, non-human, or inhuman, is the conceptual vehicle for justified violence, or a violence-producing category. Since racism requires this notion of animality, those of us interested in resisting or combating racism need to take seriously why the status of the animal is what it is. As long as these notions of the animal and the human are intact, white supremacy remains intact. So in other words, by equating Indigenous people with animals or with nature, this provides justification for doing violence to them because those categories of beings are already below the normal or the same moral status as humans. So as we'll see in the remainder of this presentation, many Indigenous philosophies contest this hierarchical relationship between humans and other than human nature, thereby offering an alternative way of conceptualizing human difference and differences between humans and nature that don't result in relationships of domination, which already contain the assumptions and norms that could justify both ecocide and genocide. So now I will focus on the Indigenous metaphysical and ethical commitments that can contest the Western metaphysical commitments that I just reviewed. So one of these commitments is ontological belonging. According to Muskogee scholar Daniel Wildcat, stated simply, Indigenous means to be of a place. However, this doesn't just refer to the fact that individuals are born in particular places. To be of a place is an active concept that denotes an ongoing relationship that shapes and reshapes the identity of the place and the individuals that inhabit it. Place is not an abstract concept that can simply be pointed to on a map. Place is connected to the land itself, and the land is the ground on which all relationships take place. It is the foundation for relationality, and it is also the foundation for identity. For example, according to one Hopi origin story, the people came into the world from below the Earth's surface and were instructed by their creator to honor and take care of their Mother Earth, as well as to preserve the continuity of Hopi cultural traditions. Likewise, in the Choctaw creation story, the Choctaw people, along with several other nations, including the Chickasaw and Muskogee, were created underground. One by one, the peoples of each nation emerged to the surface of the earth from a cave. Some of them left, moving to other regions, but the Choctaw, who were the last to emerge, were told by their creator to stay and make a home at that location, which is known as Ninayaya, or Mother Mound. In both of these stories, the earth literally gives birth to the people, illustrating the deep connection between humans and land. These origin stories highlight a fundamental aspect of many Indigenous cultures around the world, that the people and the land are one, united through kinship as well as responsibility for one another. They help illustrate how, to put it in Laurel and Witt's words of the Choctaw, the relation to belonging to the land is ontologically basic. Simon Ortiz of the Acoma Pueblo elaborates on this notion. He states that Indigenous origin and emergence from the land for Pueblo peoples and other indigenous cultures is literal and not symbolic. And I apologize for my mispronunciation. Daishu Stu Demu is spoken quite often with a pointed hand or foot, gently stamped to indicate that earth is where the people originated. From here, land, earth, ground, we arose and were given life. Literally, yes. Mere symbol, no. Land, earth, ground is the material origin of people and all other forms of life and the living. This understanding includes not only living human societies and cultures, but also the myriad items in all of creation, animate and inanimate. A similar sentiment is echoed in the Australian Aboriginal context, in which some nations hold the land to be literally an ancestor. As Eileen Moreton Robinson of the Gwenpool Quandamuka explains, Indigenous people's sense of belonging is derived from an ontological relationship to country, derived from the dreaming. The ontological relationship occurs through the intersubstantiation of ancestral beings, humans and land. It is a form of embodiment. As the descendants and reincarnation of these ancestral beings, Indigenous people derive their sense of belonging to country through and from them. As Ortiz explains, if the people's origin from the earth is a basic fact of existence, if this isn't acknowledged, there is, quote, no way to understand obligation and responsibility that is basic to the relationship our Indigenous human community has had to land, end quote. In other words, one's ethical relationship to the land comes from recognizing the land as one's creator. This type of obligation is intimate and personal. In Robin Wall Kimmerer's words of the Potawatomi, the land and the rest of the living world, including plants, animals, water, and air, are understood, quote, as a set of relationships and responsibilities. We inhabit a landscape of gifts peopled by non-human relatives, the sovereign beings who sustain us, end quote. The importance of the relationship to the land for many Indigenous peoples can't be understated. It is a family member and living relative, the source of ethical and social obligation, and also the keystone of Indigenous identity. Given this deep connection between land and identity, when this connection is disrupted or severed by ecocide, the identity of the Indigenous community is also threatened. Philosopher Robert Figueroa refers to the relation between land and people as an environmental identity, which is the amalgamation of cultural identities, ways of life, and self-perceptions that are connected to a given group's physical environment. Environmental identity is also related to the concept of environmental heritage, wherein, quote, the meanings and symbols of the past frame values, practices, and places we wish to preserve for ourselves as members of a community. Our environmental heritage is our environmental identity in relation to the community viewed over time, end quote. Environmental identity is the identity of a group that a group forges over time through particular relationships, beliefs, and practices with land, rivers, animals, plants, and other environmental entities. It contributes to the group's understanding of who they are. Thus, the existence of environmental identity means that ecocide, when it targets this aspect of group life, does not just make living off the land more difficult for a given group, it also unravels the ties that bind a community together, forcing communities to rethink their self-identity in the same way that the destruction of the language or social institutions of a community might also do. To give an example, I want to bring up the Makah tribe and their concept of ontological belonging. So in the Makah Indian tribes, reservation land is located on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State in the United States. And it's a coastal community whose identity as a people is tied strongly to their geographical location near the ocean, as well as to the animals and plants in the region. Their tribal name means people who live near the rocks and seagulls. So we can see even in their name is tied to the land that they're connected to. However, their identity as an ocean-based whaling community has been under threat since the arrival of European explorers and settlers. In 1855, the tribe ceded 487 square miles of land to the US government in the Treaty of Nia Bay. Their land is now 46 square miles. However, they did manage to maintain that within the treaty, they were able to negotiate the, quote, right of taking fish and of whaling and sealing at usual and accustomed grounds and stations. And one of the reasons that they fought so hard to have this maintained within the treaty was that they could preserve food and economic sovereignty. Unfortunately, the rising whaling industry made this a near impossibility. In the 1920s, the Makah had to voluntarily gave up whaling after commercial whaling industries, predominantly run by settlers, nearly hunted Eastern Pacific gray whales to extinction. And Eastern gray whales were one of their primary food sources. Even after the gray whale population recovered, efforts to resume whaling were stymied by the US, the Environmental Protection Agency claiming to need to do further review, and also by animal rights activists who didn't think that whaling would be appropriate treatment of whales. However, tribal elders and members have expressed concerns that being unable to practice these traditional ways of life has harmed the physical, mental, and social health of many tribal members. However, it is worth noting that within the Makah Nation themselves, not everyone agrees that whaling is something that needs to be done. For some folks, this does represent an important part of their identity as Indigenous people. For others, they believe that there are other ways to practice their Indigenous identity without engaging in whaling specifically. However, the point here is to illustrate how the disruption of traditional ways of life, such as whaling, because of ecocide and the near extinction of the gray whale, as well as the reduction of their territories, has made it much harder for this community to sustain themselves independently. And I know I'm getting close to my time limit, so I'm just going to say a few more things. One last point about that challenges the human nature dualism. As we can see, these intimate relationships with land seem to suggest that the relationship between human and nature is not one of domination, but one of respect and kinship. In addition to this, there's a similar kind of relationship to non-human plants and animals. So the relation between Indigenous people and the land calls into question the validity of the human nature dualism and human exceptionalism, because the land itself is regarded as an active participating member of the community rather than a passive resource. But according to Shawnee philosopher Thomas Norton Smith, Native Americans have an expansive notion of personhood, which reflects the insights that 1, personhood does not constitute the essence of a human being. 2, an entity is a person by virtue of its membership and participation in a network of social and moral relationships and practices with other persons. And 3, moral agency is at the core of personhood. This view of personhood contrasts sharply with many theories of personhood in the Western worldview, which almost exclusively attribute personhood to humans due to various characteristics that are supposedly unique to human life, primarily rationality, agency, and free will. Because the Western notion of personhood relies on human uniqueness, it frequently assumes a hierarchy between humans, animals, and other beings. However, many Indigenous cultures, especially those in North America, but also Maori communities and Aboriginal Australians, Indians, Indigenous South Americans, and others, recognize non-human beings to be equal and or related community members to whom humans have ethical responsibilities. As Georgia Tuari Stewart of the Maori explains, all Maori are related to the plants and animals of Aotearoa, or New Zealand. The hills and waterways of one's ancestral home area, known in Maori as one's literal place to stand, are part of the body of the primordial Mother Earth deity, who is our ancestor. Plants and animals are the descendants of the ancestor god of all living things, from whom people are descended, according to Maori ideas about the world. In other words, all life is kin because all life descends from the same deities, who are also deities of the earth, the land itself. According to this worldview, animals, plants, and rivers, and so on, are literally family. If non-human beings are family and kin to humans, they would therefore be members of the group's community. Even where non-human beings are not thought of as members of separate nation, as family, in many Native American societies, they have traditionally been seen as members of separate nations, which are similar to human nations, and with whom humans can enter treaty relations. One example of non-human nationhood is described by Robin Wall Kimmerer of the Potawatomi. She claims that state boundaries on maps can be replaced by ecological regions, showing the various nations shaped by the iconic beings who shape the landscape, such as the Salmon Nation, Pinyon Nation, and Maple Nation. Humans can also be citizens of these nations. As she explains, this too is what it means to be a citizen of Maple Nation, having maple in your bloodstream, maple in your bones. We are what we eat, and with every golden spoonful, maple carbon becomes human carbon. Our traditional thinking had it right. Maples are people, people are maples. In fact, she continues, the Anishinaabe word for maple is the man tree. Here, Kimmerer not only claims that trees and animals are people who have their own nations, but also states that humans are citizens of those nations, demonstrating that humans are not the center or pinnacle of political society. And I think I need maybe 3 or 4 more minutes to wrap up, if that's okay. Okay. So ecocide is not a moral harm suffered only by humans, but a moral harm experienced by non-human beings like rivers and whales. In fact, the fact that rivers and whales are recognized as kin, neighbors, or sovereign nations within indigenous cosmologies and philosophies emphasizes this fact by respecting that such beings have their own purposes independent of human value. When nature is regarded as another nation, ecocide is genocide. As Caitlin Reed of the Yurok, Kupa, and Oneida explains, the distinction between genocide and ecocide stems from a worldview that ideologically separates human beings from nature, failing to recognize the interconnection and interdependency between people and ecosystems. In reality, we are a part of the land, and the land is us. The interrelatedness of humans and nature is ontologically basic and forms not just a spiritual foundation for these communities, but the ethical, social, and political foundations for their lives as well. As long as ecocide and genocide are treated as separate crimes, so persists a particular worldview that does not and cannot account for the specific harms experienced by Indigenous communities. So to conclude, I'd like to just very briefly review the value of international ecocide laws for Indigenous peoples. As stated earlier, the current push to criminalize ecocide has involved deliberately making it a crime separate from genocide. For Felipe Sands, the merit of criminalizing ecocide internationally as a crime separate from genocide is that the emphasis of the crime would be the harms done to nature, not to humans. As Sands explains, quote, harm to the human may be one indicator of whether the crime of ecocide takes place, but it cannot be the only one, end quote. Criminalizing ecocide in this way would formally acknowledge the dependence humans have on the environment and would also provide a legally and politically backed normative moral framework that would begin to shift the narrative of human dominance and exploitation of nature to one of human respect for nature. These reasons would benefit all humans, but they don't address the specific concerns and needs of Indigenous people. According to Article 26 of the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Indigenous peoples have the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources that they possess. Indigenous people have the rights to lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned and occupied or otherwise used or acquired. Indigenous peoples have the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources that they possess by reason of traditional ownership or other traditional occupation or use, as well as those which they have otherwise acquired. States shall give legal recognition and protection to these lands, territories, and resources. Such recognition shall be conducted with due respect to the customs, traditions, and land tenure systems of the Indigenous peoples concerned. Adding ecocide to the Rome Statute as the fifth crime against peace would provide Indigenous people with greater legal recourse to assert and protect these rights. This is particularly important in the context of settler colonial nation states, such as the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, which are also the 4 countries that initially refused to ratify the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In countries like the US, which continue to refuse to acknowledge the genocide of Indigenous peoples, making ecocide an international crime could help Indigenous people to hold these nation states accountable and provide them with new, internationally recognized and legally available means of resisting further harm and imposition from these states. Finally, making ecocide an international crime has implications for the rights of nature. Recognizing that ecocide is genocide or is related to genocide or is an international crime helps to pave the way for the development and protection of the rights of various non-human entities in a way that could see those entities as having inherent value, independent of their immediate human interest. In recent years, environmental entities, including the Wanganui River in New Zealand, Lake Erie in the United States and Canada, and all the rivers of Bangladesh have been granted some form of legal personhood. In many of these cases, Indigenous peoples have led the fight for the acknowledgement of the rights of nature because their culture already recognizes many environmental entities as persons. However, making ecocide an international crime in the way proposed by the Stop Ecocide Foundation would continue to treat the destruction of human and non-human communities as fundamentally different in kind and perhaps perpetuate the human nature dualism, even as it attempts to remove anthropocentrism from the moral harm of the crime. As Indigenous scholars like Caitlin Reed and Dina Gilio Whitaker suggest, the separation of ecocide from genocide could do Indigenous communities a disservice because it does not validate the kinds of relationships they have with the natural world. In addition to this, current efforts to make ecocide an international crime continue to function using Western legal frameworks, Western notions of personhood, property, and value. The very same notions that were used to dispossess Indigenous people of their lands while justifying the destructions of culture, language, and spiritual beliefs. Nor does this effort radically disrupt the global capitalist economy, which was built on and is continued to be fueled by the exploitation of Indigenous peoples and their lands. So while making ecocide an international law may assist Indigenous people in protecting themselves and their lands from within the system, it doesn't offer a way out of the system. Which is why, and this is my last point, why there is a need for Indigenous sovereignty. In the United States alone, Indigenous nations manage 56.2 million acres of land. Globally, Indigenous people live on or manage almost 40% of all protected land areas in the world, which is almost a quarter of the planet's land surface. These areas also tend to be some of the least populated by humans, containing almost 80% of the world's biodiversity. Traditional ecological worldviews, ethical systems, knowledge, and methodologies, which are right now traditional ecological knowledge is sort of like buzzword for conservationists and environmental scientists. And these types of knowledge can only truly function and be generated in circumstances where Indigenous people are free to develop non-instrumental relationships with the land and engage in their traditional practices. As Eve Tuck of the, I'm going to mispronounce this, I apologize, Unangax and K. Wayne Yang explain, decolonization eliminates settler property rights and settler sovereignty. It requires the abolition of land as property and upholds the sovereignty of native land and people. In other words, decolonization means repatriation of all native land. To stop ecocide, we need to consider decolonization as a real possibility. And in giving decolonization serious consideration and in passing lands back to Indigenous people so that they have the sovereignty and authority to make decisions that are best for them and best for the lands that they occupy, this doesn't mean that we are saying that Indigenous people are perfect or that they have all of the answers to our environmental woes, as there are plenty of historic examples of Indigenous people mistreating the land as well. But repatriating lands and recognizing Indigenous sovereignty may be the only way to ensure that Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous ethical frameworks, and non-Western solutions to problems can continue to flourish, develop, and contribute to the ending the environmental crises that we're facing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such a fascinating presentation. I learned a lot from that. We do have a few questions in the Q&A, but I will remind everyone that you're welcome to raise your hand, and I can unmute you and you can ask your question out loud. So that's always an option. But I will go through the Q&A chat box here, and I will read the questions out loud, and then I'll give you the opportunity to answer. So the first one is, are there any transnational resistant movements among Indigenous peoples who have been impacted by human-driven ecocide?
That's a good question, and I don't actually have an answer for you about that. I would be shocked to hear that there aren't. I imagine, particularly, for instance, when the Dakota Access Pipeline protests were occurring, Indigenous folks from Canada also gave their support and came to help with the protests. So, I would suspect that there are international movements. In addition to this, there's evidence of international collaboration between Indigenous groups, particularly those working with international conservation groups. You can see this, for instance, there's Conservation International, for example, is a conservation group that has a statement on their policy for working with Indigenous communities that is 40 pages long, that was drafted by a committee of diverse Indigenous groups. So there are some, at least in that respect, I know that there are some formal ways in which Indigenous groups have collaborated internationally, but I don't have any examples of specific, I think, movements that you might be looking for. So I apologize for that.
It's okay, thank you. With an increasing awareness and recognition of the settler colonial genocides of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous rights, are there any mechanisms in place to protect Indigenous peoples' environmental identity and protect Indigenous peoples from the unique harms they face as a result of ecocide?
So this depends, I think, in part on different countries and policies that different countries have developed. So I mentioned early in the presentation, Ecuador and Colombia, including provisions in their constitutions for the protection of nature. And these provisions were largely pushed and promoted by Indigenous groups in those countries. So in that sense, there is some places, some countries are making an effort to protect Indigenous people. In addition to this, in the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, there is an article that talks about free, prior, and informed consent. And this has become a point around which Indigenous groups have rallied in order to kind of set criteria or standards for how governments and corporations should interact with them. So basically, free, prior, and informed consent involves informing Indigenous people about what's going to happen, and being honest and truthful and giving as much information as possible, not coercing Indigenous people into making a decision, but allowing them to freely choose and consent to a project. And of course, the prior part of it involves making sure that there's enough time that is provided. However, someplace like the United States, for example, the United States hasn't adopted a free, prior, informed consent methodology when dealing with Indigenous people. The Environmental Protection Agency, the Bureau of Land Management, these organizations that end up working with Indigenous people, they have an obligation to inform them and consult, but consulting doesn't necessarily involve it just basically means letting them know and getting some feedback, but it doesn't require people to not go forward with actions if the Indigenous community says no. So I guess in some respects, there are some protections available. In other places, there aren't, or the protections are limited, which is one reason why making ecocide an international crime might really benefit Indigenous people, in that if they're the ones who are experiencing particular types of harms, they now have a international legal way to contest those who are perpetrating those crimes against them.
Right, thank you. Gary writes, by subverting rivers, some countries exert long-term geopolitical leverage, which shapes the ecology, economy, climate, and demography of the region. Is this considered ecocide and genocide? And he gives examples like Turkey building 600 dams in the Euphrates and drying up Syria and Iraq.
So I don't know enough about those particular situations to give like a fully informed assessment of that. But the effects of damming on the land in which rivers are dammed is pretty tremendous. And if it significantly alters the ecology of the land, then that could be considered ecocide. And if it's being done for the purpose of exerting control over or eliminating another group of people, then part of that activity might be considered genocidal in the sense that it has an intent to destroy another group. Whether the destruction of that group is based on the other criteria of genocide, such as that it's racial, ethnic, religious, or national group as such, would also kind of be open to interpretation. But it's quite possible that using these frameworks of ecocide and genocide, people who are suffering as a result of that damming could make the case that what they're experiencing is genocide as a result of ecocide or environmental racism.
Thank you so much. Someone else writes, are there any cases where national laws against ecocide have been used to hold those responsible for committing ecocide accountable, despite many of the perpetrators being based elsewhere?
So to be honest, I am really like my experience and background is philosophy.
Mhm.
And so a lot of my interests have been around the philosophical, metaphysical, and epistemological implications of colonization, and thinking about what that means for how we define ecocide and genocide. So as a result, my explorations into some of the legal aspects of um, preventing ecocide are actually quite new.
Mhm.
So unfortunately, this is another question I don't have a great answer for, only because I have really only begun sort of that part of my research very recently. So I apologize.
That's okay. Thank you so much. And the last question we have here is someone writes, thank you for this hugely informative talk. You mentioned Max, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this last name, Laboiron earlier, and quoted them on something along the lines that polluted lands cannot simply be abandoned. They're wondering if you could point them to a quotation of this source.
Yes, so he didn't say specifically that pollution or polluted lands can't be abandoned. This was a paraphrase from what he was saying, but his book, Pollution is Colonialism, is what I was referencing when I was bringing up his thoughts on this. And that's a really interesting text that looks at the intersection of environmental degradation, climate change, pollution, and settler colonialism and environmental racism.
That's great, thank you. And I know you mentioned when we were speaking earlier that you will be providing your sources to us that I'm happy to share with all the attendees after this as well. So you can learn more from those sources there. So thank you so much, Professor Eichler. This was such an amazing presentation. I learned so much from this and from this perspective too, and this approach. And thank you again to the participants for joining us today as well. Before we sign off, if you missed any of today's session, we have recorded it and we will be sharing it on our website. So I think my colleague Allison has provided the link to access it there. It'll be a few days, but you will be able to find it there. And we wanted to also remind everyone not to forget to register for our next webinar, which will be taking place next week, not on Tuesday, but on Wednesday, March 9th at 3 p.m. In this presentation, we'll be hearing from Deborah McGregor, and she'll be addressing the Indigenous Peoples, colonialism, and climate justice. So we hope to see you there. Thank you so much, and stay safe, everyone, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.